Hey tribe, Dawna here with Transformational Healing, and today we are going to talk about 5 of my favorite ways to dry herbs, and an extra one that I don't necessarily use all the time, but I know that other people often do. So if you watched my last video from last week about properly harvesting herbs and all of the things that you should do to make sure that your herbs are picked in a proper way, then you are ready to go when it comes to actually drying and taking care of those herbs. So, my absolute favorite way to dry herbs is my herb rack, which is right here. So, with the herb rack, it's simply a layer of screens. So those screens slide in and out, and I can fill them loosely with the herbs that I want to dry, like the black-eyed Susans that are on them. And sometimes they're filled with daisies and other things that I actually do still harvest for all of you to put into the shop. But I like those screens, and this is just the small one because I'm not harvesting at the amount that I used to harvest at. I used to have a full floor to ceiling, full size window screens that slid in and out of these compartments, and I had herbs drying like crazy on all of those racks. But now I just have the small one, and we use it here at the house. Typically, inside the house, I'm actually drying herbs in the basement, which is not necessarily a good thing, but I have a dehumidifier down there that is set to either 45 or 50, and I put that rack right next to the dehumidifier, so it slowly dries the herbs over several days. You want to make sure, like I said in that last video, those herbs are not wet when you pick them. So, my second favorite way to dry herbs when I'm on the go is that whatever I use to pick the herbs in, I then transfer them. If we're out at camp, out at Brushwood Folklore Center, I will transfer them into paper bags like this. And obviously, making sure you label them and put the dates on them so that you have that for your records. And if you look inside, you will see that there are dried black-eyed Susans. Those are black-eyed Susans that I picked while we were out at Brushwood Folklore Center. And we didn't have the rack or my dehumidifier with me, so we put them in a brown paper bag. And you can either just make sure that they're in a dry place, or you could put them in a place that has a little bit more heat. So I actually put that bag in the front window of my truck and went out every few hours and shook it and moved it around. You want to make sure it's packed very loosely. And you could leave it out in the sun in a place where it'll be warm but not wet. You could do it inside. But when you use this paper bag system, you have to make sure that you are moving it around constantly. And usually you want to do that with herbs that you don't need to dry flat. So the heat in the car, depending on how hot it is, could actually be a little too hot to dry herbs, so you have to be careful. It was only about 70 degrees, so I guesstimated it would be a little over 100 in the car, but not really, really too hot. So, and I checked on them regularly to make sure they weren't drying too fast. So the paper bag keeps out the direct sunlight. You never want to dry your herbs in direct sunlight. You always want to have them shaded, or they will just completely bleach out. So, method number 3 is hanging herbs. And you see this in all kinds of shops and in the movies and things like that. You see herbs hanging in the witch's cottage and in the herb shops from the rafters. And I often do that. I tend to do it with stuff like this, the sage sticks. So I might do it with bunches of herbs. Say I picked bunches of lavender, I might do it with bunches of lavender. But I tend to do it more for when I'm making the sage sticks because I have the other drying methods that I prefer over that. So if I'm making any type of burning herb or cleansing herb stick, or if I was going to dry mullins to make hag torches, the tops of the mullein plants are often rolled in beeswax with other herbs on them for protective things and then burned like a candle very carefully. um, I would do it like this. That is how I would dry them. I would dry them by hanging them. I do, like I said, tend to hang them over my dehumidifier so that it's closer to the dehumidifier, so I know that the temperature is down. And they need to dry for probably, depending on how thick they are, at least a week. You'd be surprised how long things are still wet for in the middle. It may feel dry on the outside, but it's not quite dry on the inside. So drying methods like these tend to take time when you're just letting them dry naturally, but that is best for the herbs. When you have the herbs in the rafters, perhaps it is an herb that as it dries, it's going to fall off of the plant. So you're drying something that you're hanging up like the lavender, and you don't want to lose the pieces of the lavender. You can use two of my tricks in one. You hang up the herb by wrapping around the stems of the herbs and hanging it up, but you also put a bag around underneath it and a bag, and then connect the bag to the top as well. So you're drying it in a bag but hanging. So that is another way to go with that. If you want to speed the process up a little bit, you can use a dehumidifier. When you do herbs in a dehumidifier, it's not the same like making beef jerky or drying nuts or making fruit roll up or dehydrating fruits and vegetables. All of the things, at least on my dehydrator, have a line and a temperature on the little dial so that you can adjust the temperature of the dehydrator. Herbs are suggested to dry between 95 and 100 degrees. So you want to make sure you have that low temperature. And at 95 to 100 degrees, it typically takes multiple hours, even, depending on what you're putting in there. But for black-eyed Susans, I have that big brown or black eye in the center. It's going to take a long time for that to dry. And the more spaced out you put things on your layers, the better they will dry. I've done it where I needed to put so many leaves in there all at the same time that I didn't have enough air room moving around them, and it took even longer. I probably would have been better to put less in at a time. They would have gone faster, and then put in a second batch rather than trying to squeeze them all in at the same time. Now for the method that I personally do not use, but I know that there are people out there that do use this method and they don't have a dehydrator and they want to use the oven. Now, the lowest that my oven will go is 250 degrees. Remember, I said that herbs need to dry at 95 to 100 degrees. So, if you really need to use the oven method, the suggestion is that you put it as low as your oven will go, and then you leave the door open because you want it to be, or leave the door cracked open so that it never actually reaches that 200 or 250 degrees, that it only stays about 100 degrees in there. And you can dry the herbs rather quickly if you dry them at 200 degrees, but they're also very brittle. They've lost some of their medicinal value if they are medicinal herbs, or their nutritional value because you've cooked them. So you're cooking them, not drying them. If you get over that, like maybe over like 115, 120 degrees, you're really starting to cook the herb. So it's just something that you want to definitely take into consideration. I hope that you have learned some new tricks or tips or techniques, or maybe the only thing that you learned is that herbs need to be dried only around 100 degrees and not hotter than that. If you missed last week's video on how to properly pick and harvest those herbs, you should definitely check it out. And on Thursday of this week, we are going to talk about what to do now that you have all these herbs or you've been purchasing herbs. What are the best ways to store your herbs so that they last the longest? Because who wants their herbs going bad? You want to make sure that your herbs stay healthy. So be sure to check out that video when it comes out later this week. And until then, many blessings, tribes. We'll see you real soon.